Hello, Nigel here. I couldn't help noticing that you're still awake. Now, I'm an owl. I'm supposed to be up at night, but you need your sleep. So if it's your allergy symptoms that are keeping you up, here's a word to the wise. Try Xyzal. You see, Xyzal works fast to relieve sneezing, runny nose, itchy watery eyes, and itchy nose and throat. And it keeps going strong for 24 hours, so you can get your sleep and wake up refreshed and ready for a productive day ahead. Be wise, all. Take Xyzal at night. Use as directed. Starts working in 45 minutes.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile with a message for everyone paying big wireless way too much. Please, for the love of everything good in this world, stop. With Mint, you can get premium wireless for just $15 a month. Of course, if you enjoy overpaying, no judgments, but that's weird. Okay, one judgment. Anyway, give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. Intro rate first 3 months only, then full price plan options available. Taxes and fees extra. See full terms at mintmobile.com.
Welcome back, True Crime Army. I am your host, Margot, and this is Military Murder, a show where I focus on crimes committed by military members and veterans. But don't worry, you don't have to know anything about the military to listen, I promise. You just have to be a true crime enthusiast, and if that's you, welcome home. If you haven't listened to the show in a while, I want to recommend that you stop and go back and listen to last week's episode first, as today I am covering part 2 of serial killers Leonard Lake and Charles Ng. I think you might be a little lost if you started listening to this miniseries on this episode. Now, if you're already all caught up, then you are in the right place. And today we are going to talk about some of the disappearances that appear to all have one connection, Leonard Lake. I'll also tell you about Charles Ng. Before I begin, I want to do another call for listener stories. If you have a crime story that occurred to you or at one of the bases that you were stationed at, or even when you were living off base, or if you have a haunted military base story, please write in to the link in the show notes. And in a few weeks, I will read all the stories in an episode that I title Tales from the Trenches. Tales from the Trenches episode 1 and 2 were wild, and I can't wait to hear more stories because I know that there are more out there. All right, with that, join me today as I tell you part 2 of a 3-part miniseries on the serial killing duo Leonard Lake and Charles Ng. Now, let's dig in.
Military murder is an independent project and is not endorsed by the Department of Defense or any military component. The views expressed are those of the host. The content of this podcast is not meant to be legal or medical advice. Warning, this episode contains graphic details of murder and is not suitable for young listeners. Listener discretion is advised.
On January 27, 1964, 3 months after turning 18 years old, Leonard Lake joined the Marine Corps. He was assigned as a radar technician, and his first duty station was Camp Lejeune in North Carolina. Leonard adapted to military life quickly because he was fascinated by weapons, fire control, and rifle tactics. He was trained in chemical use, explosives, demolition, and guerrilla warfare. He loved navigation, and camo became his dress of choice, even after he eventually left the military. While stationed in North Carolina in 1965, Leonard was introduced to an 18-year-old woman named Karen Lee Rodell while he was visiting his family in South Carolina. The pair immediately hit it off, and even though Karen had to return to college and Leonard had to return to the Marines, they corresponded by mail for nearly 2 years. But in 1967, while Leonard was on his first tour in Vietnam, Karen's letters became more and more sparse, until they completely stopped. When Leonard returned to the U.S., Leonard was PCS to Point Mugu Naval Air Station. He and Karen began to correspond again, and Karen shared that she was lonely and having family issues. Leonard felt something for Karen, so in March of 1969, he took military leave, flew to Delaware, proposed to Karen, and by the end of the month, they were married. Karen would later describe that the early marriage was just, basic, but that Leonard began to show weird tendencies. One thing that annoyed her was that while they would be around other Marines, Leonard would joke about selling his wife's body to them. At first, Karen just kind of laughed it off, but the more he continued with the jokes, she wondered if deep down inside he was serious. But it wasn't just the jokes. Leonard often asked his wife to dress in a more revealing manner, and he wanted her to wear costumes. Another thing that happened while married is that Leonard saw himself as the master and Karen as his slave. While Karen wasn't keen on this, she did as he pleased, and then she was excited when in 1970, Leonard volunteered to deploy to Vietnam for a second time. Now, just FYI, you know your marriage is in danger when you're excited that your spouse is deploying. While deployed, Leonard saw all the men around him receive Dear John letters, and he became paranoid that his wife was cheating on him. In addition to that stress was the very close stress of actual war. Leonard was stationed in Da Nang. While overseas, Leonard sought help, but he refused to go to chaplains because he declared himself an atheist. Instead, Leonard went to mental health. He was ultimately diagnosed with, quote, impending schizophrenia along with hysterical neurosis, end quote. The doctor recommended that Leonard return home immediately, and he did. When Leonard returned from his second deployment, he was admitted into the psychiatric ward of the military hospital, where he stayed for almost 2 months. While there, he was declared a danger to himself and others. After he was released, he was medically discharged from the Marine Corps in April of 1971. After leaving the military, Leonard and Karen found a place to live in San Jose, and things started to get uncomfortable for Karen. Leonard tried to find a job but wasn't successful, and he eventually suggested that Karen could make some really good money dancing at the bar. Well, Karen applied and got the gig. Then, Leonard was getting paranoid and started talking about building a fallout shelter to protect them from nuclear war. Now that Karen was dancing at a bar, Leonard wanted more, so he proposed that they participate in wife swapping and playful bondage. Karen wasn't at all comfortable when the playful bondage turned into being tied up and her husband wouldn't cut her loose. Leonard would slap her or hit her when she was tied up, and he expected Karen to tell him that she liked it. Well, Karen didn't like it, and it became less mutual and more Leonard doing things to her as less than a willing participant. Besides controlling her sexually, Leonard was also controlling the finances. Karen was the one working. She was working as a dancer in a bar, and Leonard would come by the bar daily to pick up her tips, and on paydays, he would take her check from her. Karen had had enough after Leonard saw her leaving the bar she danced at with another man who was one of her regulars there. Honestly, not sure what her intentions were, but when Leonard saw that, he went back to their apartment, threw all of Karen's clothes out, and boarded up the doors and windows. And that was the end of it for Karen. Karen separated from Leonard Lake in October or November of 71. She filed for divorce, and it was finalized the following year. Karen would later reveal that in her entire life, Leonard was the only person she ever met who had a God complex. If he ever heard someone around him say, "Oh, God," he would respond, "Yes," and he wasn't kidding. Through the 1970s, Leonard met several women through personal ads in the paper. Think of personal ads as the online dating of the 70s. 50 years ago, there wasn't such a thing as the internet or Tinder or Match.com. So this was a common way for people to meet each other. In 1972, Leonard met a woman through one of these personal ads, and we're going to call her Molly. And Molly and Leonard dated for about 3 months. Molly said that Leonard was sweet, gentle, and caring at the beginning, but then he started getting kinky and he wanted her to participate in bondage, sex work, and partner swapping. Today, we call that swinging. Molly wasn't on board for all of that, so she broke off the sexual relationship and they just became roommates. But Leonard was still all about control, and he continued to force Molly to perform sex work to make her pay him back for renting and furnishing the apartment. He took pictures of her when she was sleeping in the buff and refused to turn the negatives over to her, furthering his leverage over his roommate. Then, Leonard started telling Molly about how he wanted to make a snuff film. Now, if you're not familiar with what that is, basically a snuff film, according to Leonard Lake, is where someone films 2 people having sex and then one of the partners kills the other during the climax of the movie. Leonard told Molly that making a snuff film would, quote, create a passion for a woman that would be unequal, end quote. No, Leonard, it's horrible. And Molly was like, no way. Molly started to see the paranoid side of Leonard after their sexual relationship ended. He told her that he had cyanide in a tooth in his mouth in case he had to kill himself on the spot, and that he wanted to build an underground bunker so in case of another Holocaust or war, he could protect his family and friends in it. Molly, seeing as paranoid this guy was, got the heck out of there after she and Leonard got into an argument. He managed to trip her and get her down on the ground where he pinned her with his boot. But Molly got away and then left for good. Today's episode is sponsored by Acorns, and April is Financial Literacy Month, an entire month dedicated to taking control of your money. Because honestly, no one really taught me how to manage money growing up. I didn't learn about investing until I was well into adulthood. But what I love about Acorns is that it makes it easy to start saving and investing for your future in just 5 minutes. I know, April is an entire month, but you don't need an entire month to learn. You don't need to be an expert. Acorns recommends a diversified portfolio that matches you and your goals. You can start with just your spare change. And you don't need a lot of time. Setup takes just 5 minutes because I know that your time is precious. And if financial wellness has ever felt out of reach, Acorns makes it simple, giving your money a chance to grow without the overwhelm. Personally, using Acorns gave me the confidence to stop putting it off and just start. And that peace of mind is completely worth it. Sign up now and join over 14 million all-time customers who've already saved and invested over $25 billion with a B dollars with Acorns. Head to acorns.com/militarymama or download the Acorns app to get started today. Paid non-client endorsement. Compensation provides incentive to positively promote Acorns. Tier 1 compensation provided. Investing involves risk. Acorns Advisors LLC, an SEC registered investment advisor. View important disclosures at acorns.com/militarymama.
This episode is brought to you by Netflix. 3 couples, 4 vacations, a lot to unpack. Watch The 4 Seasons, a new series starring comedy favorites Tina Fey, Steve Carell, Will Forte, Coleman Domingo, and more in a hilarious and heartfelt love letter to long-term relationships. Based on the original Alan Alda film. Watch The 4 Seasons, streaming now only on Netflix.
In 1974, Leonard answered an ad on a bulletin board from a woman who needed someone to help her and her 16-year-old daughter move. I imagine it was one of those neighborhood bulletin board papers where people put a notice up with their phone numbers on the bottom that you can kind of like tear off. Leonard reached out through the ad and helped the mother-daughter duo move. He also asked the mother if he could take pictures of her daughter. They agreed and he took some pictures. They were pretty normal, at first. But one night, Leonard showed the teenager a photo album of a young girl taking her clothes off and asked if she wanted to take some that were like that. The young girl immediately declined, but Leonard drugged her. She thought he slipped something into her drink, and he took unsavory pictures of her while she was incapacitated. The 16-year-old had no memory of him taking them, but Leonard used the pictures he took to extort her, saying he would show her mother if she didn't let him take more pictures like that. The teen was shy and naive and let Leonard take more pictures. One time, he tied her to the bed at his house. He pretended to just take pictures, but took advantage of the situation and then raped the teenager. The girl screamed for him to stop and that she was going to tell her mom. Leonard growled at her that no one would believe her because he had those other pictures of her that she agreed to take in provocative poses. Of course, she hadn't really agreed to those. She had been manipulated and groomed and probably drugged by this monster. Leonard continued to contact the young girl to extort her, but instead of taking pictures, he would rape the young girl. This continued until he moved to Ukiah, California in 1975. Over the next 5 years or so, Leonard lived in Ukiah at Greenfield Ranch. There was a lot of information about what happened while he lived there, but I'll do my best to consolidate since this part is already getting really long. Leonard claimed to some people that he was pagan, but he met some girl named Charla through a mutual friend at church. Charla was hesitant to be set up through this mutual friend who was an elderly woman, but finally relented after the church lady persisted. She was probably like, listen, girl, you're getting kind of old and the time is ticking. Charla and Leonard spoke on the phone initially before meeting and entering into a relationship together. Charla, wisely, didn't quite trust Leonard and never told him where she lived. Leonard fed her the big lie about being raised in an orphanage and not having any family, blah, blah, blah. He told her that his family abandoned him when he was little, which, as we know, is a lie. Leonard did have a best friend, though, a man named Charles Gunner that Leonard referred to as his blood brother. Apparently, Leonard and Gunner had a pact that said that whichever one got married, the other could sleep with the other's wife first. So that means if Gunner got married, his wife would have to sleep with Leonard first and vice versa. And mind you, this is stuff that he's telling to a girl that he's interested in. Leonard never expressed his love for Charla, but did ask her to marry him, and he continually pressed her for information about her financial assets and her financial situation. He also wanted to know if she owned any firearms. Charla played her cards close and never divulged whether she had anything that Leonard asked about. It's a good thing because Leonard eventually told her that his fantasy life was to have a complete harem of women who took care of his every need. He called this the Miranda Project. Leonard moved away from Charla in 1978, but he returned in 1981 and wanted to rekindle things with Charla. She finally caved and gave him her real address. He showed up to her house demanding that she marry him again, which is kind of weird that after 3 years apart, he'd think he'd just show up and it would be a good idea to propose again. Leonard told Charla that if she didn't say yes, then she'd never see him again. She must have said no, but he didn't stay away like he had promised. Because Leonard Lake showed back up, and this time he tried to break in. Thankfully, he was unsuccessful. Besides Charla, there was a long list of women who all self-described themselves as naive and gullible. Yup, they all slept with him. Leonard Lake was that type of guy. One time, he manipulated a woman named Tanya Levy into deeding half of her property to him. Tanya was looking for a partner to help her finish building her house. Once she signed over half of her property to Leonard, he came clean about his real plans, which included theft. This woman ended up selling the other half of her property to Leonard Lake and ducked out of that situation as soon as possible. There are so many more stories about Leonard propositioning women for photos, including nudes, of themselves and also of their young daughters. And Leonard Lake was not only obsessed with nudity, but he was obsessed with guns, a nuclear holocaust, and the bunker he was building on his property. So I'm not going to talk too much about Leonard Lake and how many nude photos he took of women. But one time he took pictures, they weren't nude pictures because this woman refused, but he took pictures of a married woman. Months later, after turning Leonard's request down, this woman's husband picked her up from work and was upset and asked her if she was leaving him. This woman had no idea why her husband thought she was leaving, and then her husband told her that all her things were gone from the house. You see, Leonard had burglarized their house and took all of the woman's belongings, her clothes and her jewelry. So that's just the type of guy that this Leonard Lake fellow was. During the same time period, Leonard provided several different aliases to people that he met. His aliases included Ted White, Tom Myers, Donald Lake, Michael, Steve, and others. Leonard's bestie, Charles Gunner, married a woman named Victoria Johnson in 1979. Since we have two men named Charles in the story, Charles Gunner and Charles Ng, we'll refer to this bestie as Gunner. When Victoria and Gunner got married, Leonard was their best man. In 1981, Leonard married a woman named Clara Lynn, who went by Cricket. We met her earlier in the story, and it was her name and address that was found on the utility bill in Paul Costner's car. At the time they married, Leonard was 35 and Cricket was 24 years old. No word on if Leonard and Gunner fulfilled their freaky pact about sleeping with the other's spouse on the wedding night, though. Before I continue, I want to just tell you what other things Leonard was doing during this time period. Leonard was obsessed with survivalism, and he and other men with similar interests were like pen pals. Leonard met most of these men through the Soldier of Fortune magazine, where he would place ads to meet other survivalists. I guess it's really no different than Facebook groups or Reddit groups today. In any event, Leonard wanted to maintain his anonymity, so he used a pseudonym, Tom Myers. It was during this ad placement in this specific magazine that Leonard met a young Army soldier named Mark Novak. Eventually, Mark went to visit Leonard in California while he lived in a commune-like place, and this place was called The Ranch. Mark's visit lasted 3 days, and while Mark recognized that Leonard was full of poop, he enjoyed talking to him. Yeah, Mark figured his real name was Leonard when everyone in the ranch called Tom Myers Leonard. While Leonard lived in the ranch, many neighbors suffered burglaries and various things went missing. It was believed Leonard Lake was the thief, but I guess they just could never prove it. The ranch was supposed to be a violence-free location, free from guns and whatnot, and Leonard was eventually kicked out of the ranch when his property went up in flames and all his stashed up ammo exploded. Leonard was also charged with stealing from his employer and was sentenced to a year of probation. The ranch was sick of Leonard's shenanigans, so they asked Leonard and Cricket to leave, and as I already stated, they did. After leaving the ranch, Leonard and Cricket settled in a small place called Philo, where Leonard took on the role of managing a motel. Even though Leonard Lake was different, he always seemed to get in good with the locals, at least initially. Once Leonard began introducing himself around town, he became one of 40 unpaid volunteer firemen in the county. He also became the fire department's secretary and even wrote their bylaws. During this time, Leonard placed an ad in the Bay Guardian. It was a San Francisco newspaper. The ad was looking for a worker bee, someone willing to relocate to a rural town to help operate and maintain a small motel. A young 18-year-old woman named Connie took on the job and then realized not only would she actually be doing housekeeping for the small motel that Leonard was running, but she was basically a sex partner for both Leonard and his wife, Cricket. Eventually, Connie realized that this wasn't the life for her, so she gave her 2 weeks' notice. Around this same time, Leonard got a message from Mark Novak. Remember the soldier that he met through the Soldier magazine? Well, Mark was giving Leonard a heads up that he gave a fellow Marine, Charles Ng, Leonard's contact info. It appeared that Ng had escaped from military detention pending some court-martial charges and was looking for a place to hide out. When Charles Ng showed up, Leonard figured he could give Ng Connie's position around the motel in exchange for room and board. Leonard and Ng really hit it off, especially their love for wearing camo print. It wasn't too much longer after Ng arrived that Leonard, Cricket, and Ng left the motel management gig. The motel owner was happy to see Leonard Lake leave, as he had received various complaints of Leonard being a peeping Tom. Leonard, Cricket, and Ng stayed in town for a little while longer, apparently helping with a youth camp. But Leonard and Ng's lives would soon change when 6 months into Ng's arrival, the FBI and the local sheriff's office received a tip that a Marine Corps fugitive was living among the community in Philo. On April 29, 1982, Charles Ng was arrested. Leonard Lake gave permission to search the home where they found a small arsenal of weapons. Leonard said all the weapons were his, but he wasn't aware of any contraband. Leonard said that Ng was helping him around with chores. Continuing the search outside, the investigators found 6 handguns, 6 rifles, several of them fully automatic, along with hand grenades, TNT, a silencer, tear gas, and several boxes of ammunition. Additionally, investigators found a few stolen guns and martial arts weapons in Ng's room. Leonard Lake was ultimately also arrested after it was revealed that he attempted to hide a MAC-10 assault weapon, and he also removed serial numbers from some of the guns. As reported by Dan Lasseter in the book Die For Me, Leonard Lake was facing 17 felony charges, but he refused to be held down. So when his scheduled court hearing took place, Leonard Lake simply didn't show up. He was now a fugitive. Charles Ng, on the other hand, well, he was trapped, and he was on his way back to Hawaii to face military court-martial at the hands of the Marine Corps.
Parents of tweens, if you're familiar with far-off drop-offs...
Dad, stop, right here.
Or get DMs about what's for dinner, you may be experiencing tween milestones. For your son or daughter, these can start at age 9. HPV vaccination, a type of cancer prevention against certain HPV-related cancers, can start then too.
For most, HPV clears on its own. But for those who don't clear the virus, it can cause certain cancers later in life.
Embrace this phase. Help protect them in the next.
Ask their doctor today about HPV vaccination. Brought to you by Merck.
Morning decisions. A creamy mocha frappuccino drink? A sweet vanilla? Maybe a smooth caramel? Or that white chocolate mocha? Whichever you choose, delicious coffee awaits. Start your day with bottled Starbucks Frappuccino drinks. Pick up a bottle near you wherever you buy your groceries.
In October of 1981, Charles Ng was a Marine stationed at Kaneohe, Marine Corps Station in Hawaii. Ng, as the mastermind, along with 3 other Marines, stole several weapons from the armory on base, including 2 M60 machine guns, 1 M16 rifle, 3 M203 grenade launchers, 1 Starlight scope for night firing, and 7 .45 caliber weapons. In total, the stolen property was valued at $10,300, which today is equivalent to $36,000. The 4 Marines were picked up and held for questioning in the theft of the weapons. 3 were locked up in the brig at Pearl Harbor, but 20-year-old Lance Corporal Charles Ng was being held on base at Kaneohe and managed to escape in the middle of the night. On Friday, November 20th, 1981, after one of the captured Marines spilled the beans and told investigators where to find the guns, authorities uncovered 3 caches along the Paley Highway that held the missing weapons from the base. The Marines had disassembled the guns, greased, wrapped, and sealed the parts in plastic storage tubes before burying them along the highway. Now that the Marines had the stolen weapons in hand, they could proceed with charging the Marines. But there was one little problem. Charles Ng was missing. Authorities were alerted that he had contacted a friend for money, food, and clothing, but somehow Charles Ng had escaped detention and was nowhere to be found on the island. Don Lasseter revealed in his book, Die For Me, that Ng had managed to escape through a back window. He ran across a field and knocked on one of his buddies' doors. Ng said he was being framed and asked for cover just until morning, and the friend agreed. The following morning, when the entire base was notified that they had a fugitive, Ng hopped into his friend's trunk and was driven a ways away from the base. A reward was now being offered for Ng's information, but this friend was loyal. He gave Ng $20 and left. Ng then called his army buddy, Mark Novak, who was living on Schofield Barracks, and he stayed there for 2 days. During this time period, Ng received $300 from his family. He used the money to buy some clothes and a ticket to San Francisco. After making the introduction, Charles had made his way to Northern California, where he linked up with Leonard Lake and moved in with Leonard in cricket. Now, if you're wondering how Charles was able to leave Hawaii undetected, you have to remember it was the early 80s. There was no such thing as TSA. You didn't really have to prove who you were before you boarded an airplane. If he had the financial means, all he had to do was buy a ticket, show up, and just get on the plane with whatever assumed name he used. Then he could scoot on over the Pacific to the mainland. Easy peasy, lemon squeezy. Charles Ng was born on December 24, 1960 in Hong Kong to his parents Kenneth and Oi Ping. Traditionally, families living together spanned more than one generation. Charles, his parents, 2 sisters, and several other generational family members were all squeezed into a 2-room apartment. Charles's father was a stern disciplinarian who beat Charles when he was a child, even tethering him and whipping him with the cane end of a feather duster if Ng's grades slipped and he didn't finish his homework. Kenneth Ping wanted his children to succeed and worked long hours to pay for Charles to go to private school. Kenneth would tell Charles he wasn't supposed to cry during the beatings, and if he did, well, Kenneth would beat him some more. Oi, Charles's mother, wasn't on board with the beatings and tried to get the father to stop, but it didn't work, and Kenneth continued to beat his son. Oi wouldn't let Charles play with other children because he was their only son, and she didn't want him to pick up any bad behaviors from those other kids. Charles played with a doll when he was little, but was crushed when his dad took it away from him. Kenneth feared that playing with a doll would make Charles into a sissy. Charles also had a pet chicken that he was raising, but after he couldn't find it one day, he found out it was destined for the dinner table that night. I mean, that would mess anyone up. Despite being against corporal punishment, Oi would report the children's perceived offenses to their father when he got home from work, and when they'd hear him whistling as he walked towards their house, the kids would run and attempt to hide. After Charles accidentally started a fire in class, he was expelled from the private school that he had been attending. He and his sister Betty were sent to England to attend high school. They lived with an uncle there, but this uncle was super critical of Charles and mistreated him much like his father had. Once their mother Oi came to visit, she saw how awful their uncle was being towards them, so she packed them up and brought them back with her to Hong Kong. Charles later told his sister Betty that he wanted to join the American military, specifically the Marine Corps, because he liked the status that people in uniform seemed to have, and he wanted to make his father proud of him. In 1978, Charles entered the United States on a student visa. He stayed with his Aunt Alice in San Mateo with plans to study biology at the nearby College of Notre Dame, not to be confused with the Notre Dame. He moved into the dorms and started college, but Ng only lasted a year before dropping out because he couldn't keep his grades up. Charles moved back in with Aunt Alice, and at some point, Alice was tired of driving Miss Daisy everywhere he needed to go, and asked Charles to get a dang driver's license so she didn't have to tote him around. Well, Charles got his license and purchased a car, which he promptly backed into a pole. In another incident, he managed to plow into a neighbor's car, also while in reverse. Charles Ng was such a bad driver that Alice wouldn't even ride with him because she was so terrified. When college didn't work out for Charles, Charles needed a new direction in life, so he went to visit a Marine Corps recruiter. He told the recruiter that he was fascinated by the military and had grown up watching American war movies. If you remember, Charles was only in the country on a student visa. He didn't have a green card, which is usually a minimum requirement for joining the military. Despite this, and despite the recruiter knowing this, Charles was allowed to join the Marines. He completed boot camp, went to infantry school at Camp Pendleton, then ended up being stationed in Hawaii, where he stole the guns and then escaped and fled to Northern California and started to live with Leonard Lake after meeting through an acquaintance. Charles looked at Leonard as the father or big brother he always wanted. Neighbors noticed that Leonard didn't treat Charles very well. He reprimanded Charles in front of others and spoke to him in a domineering, disparaging, and degrading manner. In return, Charles Ng acted very submissive and subservient around Leonard, doing whatever Leonard wanted him to do. I'm sure as long as he wasn't being whipped like his father did to him, Charles Ng thought Leonard Lake was a step up. On April 29, 1982, as you already heard, Charles was arrested and returned to military custody. Charles was convicted at a court-martial of conspiracy to steal government property, burglary of government property, and escape from lawful confinement on a military facility. I'm not sure when or how it happened, but Charles ended up with a broken leg and was admitted to Tripler Army Medical Center in Hawaii before his trial. A Marine who guarded Charles while he was in the hospital testified at the court-martial that Charles told him that he broke into the armory to, quote, get even with the Marine Corps, end quote, believing that he was experiencing racism in the ranks. There are mentions of Charles being tortured by Marines who guarded him while he was hospitalized. They allegedly were poking him in the feet with needles while he was stuck in a cast, unable to get away or defend himself. Charles felt that the attacks were racially motivated since his guards were all white and he was Asian. For the charges, Charles was sentenced to 3 years incarceration to be served at the U.S. Disciplinary Barracks at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. While serving his prison sentence at Leavenworth, Charles and Leonard exchanged several letters. Charles expressed his love for cricket and her dog Cinder, while Leonard wrote back to Charles about the bunker he was finally building by the cabin in Wilseyville, California. Charles served his sentence without any violations and even worked to further his education by completing courses in philosophy and psychology. Charles Ng completed his sentence on June 29, 1984, 26 months after his arrest in California. Charles requested to be returned to active service in the Marines, but not surprisingly, the Marine Corps was like, no thanks. Charles feared deportation, but it didn't happen. This would later paint the military in a bad light, because the public wondered if the military still fell for the phony birth certificate, or if they just plain forgot to deport the guy. In any event, Charles Ng returned to Northern California and met up with Leonard Lake at the cabin in July of 1984. But while Ng was serving his military jail time, Leonard Lake was causing his own ruckus back in California as a fugitive, and he was increasing his body count. Remember when I told you earlier that Leonard Lake hated his brother Donald Lake? Well, Leonard was not good at hiding his disgust of his brother. But in late 1982, while still a fugitive, Leonard Lake showed up to his mother's house ready to make amends with his brother. He was gung-ho and asked the family and Donald himself if he could take Donald with him, with the prospects of Donald making a few extra bucks as a house sitter. Everyone agreed, and Donald left with Leonard. Sadly, no one ever heard from Donald after he walked out the door. But even without Donald, accounts kept opening up in his name. And Leonard Lake, even though he talked crap about his brother receiving assistance, Leonard Lake began to cash his brother's SSDI checks for himself. By April, Leonard was getting paranoid. He wrote in his journal, quote, "must close down Donald," end quote. he next wrote about something he called Operation Fish. Charles Gunner was Leonard Lake's best friend, and Charles Gunner and Victoria were married for about 3 years before they separated in 1982 but stayed in touch because they had 2 young children together, 2 daughters. While Leonard was on the run, he would occasionally stay with Gunner at his house with the girls, and while they were besties, Leonard really didn't like Gunner. He felt that Gunner was a waste of a human. Gunner was overweight and he received disability payments from the government after his service in the military, and Leonard just hated, quote, moochers. After Gunner and his wife separated, Leonard got an idea, and as I mentioned before, or maybe I haven't, whenever Leonard got a plan or an idea, he liked to think of it in military terms. In this case, it was always an operation, or an ops. In this case, Leonard decided to kill his bestie. Leonard was really into keeping a handwritten diary, which is how investigators were able to determine these things that I'm telling you today. But anyway, Leonard coined the plan to kill his best friend Gunner as Operation Fish. Now, he used this term because oftentimes Leonard would call his friend fat. He would call him a beached whale, Moby Dick, and other derogatory terms, and he would call him this to his face. So, to be clever, Leonard came up with this name. Of course, having been friends for decades, Charles Gunner never suspected a thing. Leonard would later add that he hated that Gunner beat on his 2 young daughters, and while Leonard had a fantasy of torturing young girls, he was not pleased when Gunner physically assaulted his own daughters in Leonard's presence. And while reading about Gunner and Leonard, I couldn't quite figure out why they were friends. But then I found out that they both had their own type of sexual fetishes. And in the book Die For Me, it was revealed that Gunner was a type of a voyeur, where he would ask his wife to have sex with other men, then he would ask her to come describe the sexual encounters to him. He never wanted to watch, he just wanted to hear about them. It is even mentioned that Gunner's ex-wife had a sexual encounter with Leonard Lake at Charles Gunner's request, unsure if it was the wedding night bet or whatnot. It was April 1983 when Leonard planned his first hit on his best friend. The 2 men went out to fix up the property in Wilseyville. They were completing a trench for the gas line, installing water filters, and Leonard was going to take this opportunity to get rid of his friend. But then he realized he hadn't thought things through enough. Gunner was a heavy fellow. How could he, Leonard Lake, maybe a $185, possibly dispose of the body? Well, at the end of the month, Leonard borrowed Charles' yellow bug and moved in with Gunner and the girls. Leonard became like Uncle Leonard, helping out with the kids whenever he could. And at night, he would write in his diary all his evil and sinister plans. In May of 1983, Leonard wrote, quote, "I am a dangerous person. Society would worry if they knew I existed and what I was up to. But more than my victim, I am the most suitable of victims. I don't exist in the official world. No job, no taxes, and no one to keep track of me day to day. If I were to disappear, it might be months before anyone would even wonder. And then what could they do?" End quote. After living with Gunner for a bit, Leonard met the babysitter, who was a young girl. They had a brief sexual encounter. Pretty sure she was too young to voluntarily get into such a relationship, but as we know, Leonard Lake was a predator. Finally, on May 24th, 1983, Leonard wrote in his diary, quote, "Phase 1 of Fish complete, finally," end quote. Prior to this, Leonard got the babysitter to stay with the Gunner girls for 2 weeks. Leonard told the babysitter that Gunner needed a relaxation week away from the girls. He played the whole, "Oh, listen, the guy is heartbroken from his wife leaving, blah, blah, blah." When Leonard returned a few weeks later without Gunner, Leonard Lake told the babysitter that while on his relaxation vacation, Gunner had fallen in love with the girl and run off. The babysitter didn't think anything of it and left the girls with Leonard. And the Gunner girls didn't even bat an eye because they were happy that their abusive dad was now gone. Now, in all of my research, I couldn't find how old the Gunner girls were, but I'm assuming if they were born in 79 or 80, then they were only a few years old. It seems that during this time, Leonard really took on the role of parent or uncle, getting them ready for school, taking them out to eat, and all that jazz. But people eventually noticed that Charles Gunner was missing, specifically Gunner's soon-to-be ex-wife, Victoria. she hadn't heard from him after May. Victoria called the house looking for Gunnar, and Leonard told her that he ran off. Victoria didn't give two craps where Gunnar was, but she wanted to get the divorce court stuff rolling. Leonard attempted to tell Victoria to stop the proceedings, and Victoria said, quote, "The only way I'll stop the proceedings is if he's dead," end quote. Leonard simply said, "No need to worry about Gunnar." A few weeks later, Leonard Lake held a garage sale of all the items in Charles's house. And by the way, the yellow bug, that car, the yellow Volkswagen, became Leonard's. And guess who shows up at the garage sale? Victoria. She's like, "What the hell? Half of this stuff is mine." But Leonard Lake said, "No, I'm selling this stuff for my friend because he needs the money." And Leonard Lake actually had the audacity to make Victoria pay for her own things. And the crazy thing is that she actually paid. After this, Leonard stayed with the girls until the end of the school year. Then he made contact with their godparents, and they agreed to foster the girls until Charles Gunnar returned. But the thing is, he never returned. But in his absence, Leonard Lake took over his car and continued to cash the disability checks. When Charles Ng showed up in the picture, Leonard Lake, who was used to working alone, realized he found a good partner in crime. All of those disappearances, next time on Military Murder. Thank you so much, True Crime Army, for listening to part 2. Trust me, you are going to want to stick around because we haven't even gotten into the slave chambers. Like, parts 1 and 2 are truly just the beginning and the foundation of this story. Again, I cannot say this enough. Thank you so much for choosing to have me in your ears week after week. If you're interested in more stories not available on the public feed, consider joining me on Patreon at patreon.com/militarymurder or on Apple Premium. As I mentioned last week, this case has been a long time coming. The research was done in combination by Haley Gray, Myrtle, and myself. This script was written in collaboration with Myrtle. My sources for this miniseries include court documents, a documentary called Manifesto of a Serial Killer, a book titled Die For Me by Don Lasseter, some YouTube videos and articles found in the San Francisco Examiner, Honolulu Star Bulletin, Honolulu Advisor, The Morning Call, LA Times, Web Archive, The Modesto Bee, and The Times. Military Murder was produced by Mama Margot Productions. This episode's executive producers are Myrtle, Jen, and Falcon 13. The music was created by Tyops. Until next time, remember, you never really know what someone is capable of, so remain vigilant always. You have a fabulous week, and I'll keep digging to bring you part 3 of this serial killer miniseries next week.
Mama's working on her podcast. I don't want to.